Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Wealth Standard Podcast. This is your host, Patrick Donohoe, and we are on episode 6 of season 2, where we are talking about liberty and freedom. Today's guest is John Tamny, and the interview I had with him was fascinating. He just came out with a book. He has several other books, so definitely check him out on Amazon. But the most recent book is called The End of Work, Why Robots Won't Take Your Job and Might Get You the One You Love. Now, this is a topic that we've mentioned on the podcast before, and I know it's on a lot of people's minds, which is the rapid pace at which our society is evolving, especially when it comes to technology. Now, John is you'll see that his heart is with economic freedom. He's a very high-regarded libertarian thinker, and that's how we approach the book. But I am as well, and it wasn't this just dialogue back and forth of one another agreeing with ourselves. It was a fascinating discussion because he helped me view things in a different light, and because of how he thinks from an economic perspective, as well as his experience with the other books that he's written, plus some of the roles that he plays. One of which is the director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks. Okay, he has a perspective that you're going to find fascinating, and he talks about how the future is something to be excited about, especially with the rapid pace of technological advancement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer some copies to you guys, to the listeners. If you guys will just email us podcast at paradigmlife.net. And that'd be amazing if you guys would get the word out for him, because this is a message that I would say is in contrast to what I would assume is how the governments and the politicians and policymakers are forming their foundation, which is universal basic income. And as you'll remember, a few episodes back, this is last year, I interviewed Andrew Yang, who is actually running for president and has a totally different approach to this issue of how quickly there's advancement in the technological space. So you're going to find a different perspective here with John. He brings up some amazing points, but he'll leave you with the hope, or the feeling of hope, that any technological advancement, how things are moving, is actually going to improve society. So I'm excited for you guys to learn from John. It was an amazing interview. Go check out thewealthstandard.com for links to John's social media. He is an editor at Real Clear Markets, probably the best way to find him. But John Tamny, Tamny. But just go to thewealthstandard.com, and the show notes will have all of the pertinent links so you can follow him. So without further ado, John Tamny, the author of The End of Work, Why Robots Won't Take Your Job and Might Get You the One You Love.
Welcome to the 2018 seasons of the Wealth Standard Podcast, celebrating life, liberty, and property. You are listening to Liberty, Season 2.
It's my pleasure to welcome a fascinating guest. I'm really excited for the interview. His name is John Tamny, and he is the director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks, and he's also the senior economic advisor to Toredor Research and Trading. John, did I get that one right?
Yes, you did.
All right, awesome. And he's also an editor of Real Clear Markets. Now, John, you've written a number of books, and the one in particular that has come out recently called The End of Work, Why Robots Won't Take Your Job and Might Get You the One That You Love. I think it's a fascinating topic because a lot of books have been written that really talk about universal basic income, and also how it correlates to the rapidly evolving society. But before we kind of get into that, I would love to know your story briefly about how you gravitated toward a more libertarian free market thinking or perspective.
Well, in terms of my perspective, it pretty much emerged from just my belief that people should be free. I always like to say that I would be for economic freedom, even if you could prove to me that it made people worse off, just because I think people should be free to do what they want. Now, the fact that the visible effects of economic freedom are so great, the fact that you can look at South Korea next to North Korea and see the obvious difference when people are free to do as they want economically, that makes my argument or my passion for market economics even greater. I see around me that the more that people prosper, the more that I'm better off. It doesn't matter my income. When people get rich, my living standard soars. And so I'm also for free markets and limited government simply because I'm self-interested. I want people serving me and making my life better.
What you said is profound, but I would say it's an atypical perspective than what exists today. So could you maybe go a little deeper into the connection between, a free market and personal or individual liberty?
Free market and individual liberty. Now, how do you mean?
So what's the connection between the two? Is personal liberty is it possible without a free market, or does a free market, is it a necessity?
That's a very good point. Here's what I would say to you is that I think people can prosper without personal freedom as long as they have economic freedom. But that's very interesting. The reverse, could they prosper if they had individual freedom but no market freedom? I say not. I think there's probably lots of parts of the world where people have a fair amount of individual freedom, but they don't have the market freedom. You've got to be able to serve others and be served without intervention to get the full effect of it.
Well, I think the first point, maybe the first point that you made answered the question, because you said that you'd rather have a free market and be worse off, or have economic freedom and be worse off than not have economic freedom and be better off.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would always be for this no matter what, just because I think people should be free to do what they want to do. And I think the mistake very often that those on my side make is they say, well, look at what happens when you cut taxes. You get 3.2% GDP growth. Or look at what happens, you get this impact. And I think that's a mistake. It's not that that's not true. I think there's a lot of evidence that economic freedom correlates with economic growth. I think it's blindingly obvious. But I still think that we should say, people should be free to do what they want. And that's where I would leave it.
Well, and it's interesting because the thinking that I've had in regards to, I would say the protagonist against economic freedom is there's this kind of utopian view of how things should be, right? And that, because economic freedom, oftentimes, there's disruption that we're not able to achieve that, kind of utopian feel. And therefore, the free market or economic freedoms are discounted, or, they don't have as much merit as, maybe a more centrally planned economy.
Well, I guess I'd like to see the examples of where a centrally planned economy has worked out better for the individual. Color me skeptical. Is that to say that I think ultimately it's people who drive economic growth. If we want to get into whether economic freedom always trumps other things, there might be an argument there. I mean, I'll give you an obvious example. Probably New York and the state of New York and the state of California are probably not the most economically free parts of the U.S., but they're the most prosperous parts. I would say that probably Alabama is more economically free than either one, but Alabama doesn't come close to either one in terms of prosperity. And so there's this, what I always like to point out to people is that it's not everything. Low taxes aren't everything. Ultimately, the people are the ones who drive economic progress, and lots of productive people in New York and California who are taxed more than they are in Alabama, but they still get a lot done. And so it's not everything. And so my point is I just want people to be free.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating point, because you're You're right. You would think now there are people that are leaving. They're leaving those states, right, because of higher taxes, higher expenses. But at the same time, so much of the productivity of our economy happens in those jurisdictions. It's an interesting point. But yeah, the point I was trying to lead to is just my thoughts around why there is such a negative, and maybe it's not as negative as I may think it is, view of economic freedom, and that there's this kind of utopian view that people have that they're trying to achieve through whether it's centrally planned or economic freedom, and somehow because economic freedom, a free market, hasn't produced that utopian society, okay, that somehow essentially plan one will. And that just comes from the different remarks in regards to just how certain what's considered free markets have failed in the past.
Yeah, well, again, I guess to that I would say I don't buy too much the idea that people have a really negative view of free markets, and I don't think. I mean, I'd be curious. You may have examples. I want to hear about these examples of free markets failing. I guess I'm not buying that. Now, of course, you and I both could come out with myriad examples of centrally planned economies failing impressively. And so if there is that question, that's a fairly easy one to win. All I'm saying is I think it's a mistake for our side to tie itself up into, well, if we do this, we get results. No. The ultimate result is freedom. And so if you have that, and I think that's the way the founding fathers saw it, is that, notice how with the Constitution, there's nothing about economic growth in there. The founders just felt that people should be free. And I think they presumed based on this individual freedom that there'd be lots of prosperity. And of course there was, and there is. But I think it's a mistake to get into, well, you get this much economic growth. Look, that's a tautology. Free people are going to prosper.
And perhaps it's just the definition is flawed, right? Because I would say, the numerous, quotes about, 2008, 2009, look at what the free market did to our society, right? It's that, so it may be a disconnect as far as the definition of what economic freedom is or what a free market is.
Well, but it's also, that wasn't it. It's a mistake, I think, to call what happened in 2008 an example of free markets. I think that was a classic example of what happens when governments, in this case the Bush administration, intervene in what's healthy. We've got to remember that recessions are a very bullish sign. So are market crashes. They're merely a sign of an economy cleansing itself, cleansing itself of misuses of labor, bad businesses, bad habits developed, lousy investments. And so when you let a correction or recession run its course, you are setting the stage for the rebound, because that's the sign of an economy fixing itself, cleansing out all the bad stuff. If in 2008, if there's no bailout of Bear Stearns, I'm sorry, there is no, quote, financial crisis, which wasn't financial. There was a crisis of an intervention back in 2008. That was a government error. If Bear Stearns is allowed to go, investors are shocked. Probably Lehman Brothers goes the next week, but precisely because there's no expectation that Lehman will be saved, investors are prepared for it. Lehman was only earth-shaking insofar as the federal government intervened and created the expectation that it would be saved. Amid that, I'll point out that you also had the Bush administration banning short selling on 900 different financial stocks. Yep. Now, if you want to pour gasoline on a fire already created by government, ban the discovery of prices in a free market. Yeah. That's going to terrify investors on a level, well, we saw it in 2008. And so I think it's dangerous, and I'm not saying you are, when people say, oh yeah, well, 2008. Yeah, well, 2008 is an example of what happens when governments intervene. In this case, it was the Bush administration. As I have never hidden from this, in my first book, Popular Economics, I tied the financial crisis, and I say it wasn't financial, to the Bush administration's errors. If they had done nothing, there is no crisis.
Well, I think it was a compounding of the same thing, right? There's, the idea of derivatives and also just, the repeal of Glass-Steagall. I mean, there's a number of things that, kind of compounded on one another. They caused the crisis, and that's not economic freedom.
But that was definitely not economic freedom. And let's be clear, Glass-Steagall had nothing to do with what happened in 2008. Implicit there is that failures of financial institutions would cause a crisis. Well, but based on that, Silicon Valley is in constant crisis because just about every business started out there fails. But the main thing is, if you look at the banks, the financial institutions that were solvent back in 2008, they were the ones that were hybrid bank and investment banks. It was the ones that hadn't availed themselves of the ability to combine one way or the other that were in big trouble. And so, I think it's a mistake to say that Glass-Steagall had some role in it. No, it didn't. Failure is healthy. Always, always, always. The Bush administration intervened in failure and by nature caused a crisis. Without that intervention, there is no crisis.
Yeah, and so maybe I just have my history wrong then, because I thought that Glass-Steagall essentially, prevented kind of the investment bank and depository bank type of I don't really use collusion, but the ability for investment banks to lend on deposits. So and maybe I'm just totally misinformed.
Yeah, I mean, let's remember the rest of the world.
Not the reason, but a part of it.
No, because remember, the rest of the world never had to abide Glass-Steagall. And so why didn't the rest of the world collapse? Let's remember it was the hybrid. It was J.P. Morgan, a bank investment bank. It was Bank of America, a bank investment bank that were able to save the singular institutions. Glass-Steagall had nothing to do with what happened. Bear Stearns was just an investment bank. Those were the ones that needed to be saved. And so, no. And remember also that, again, the rest of the world didn't suffer under something as ridiculous as Glass-Steagall. And it didn't implode as a result.
Yeah, maybe I'm just misinformed. I mean, I thought, well, the ripple effect of what happens in the U.S., affects the entire world. But at the same time, a lot of the world, whether it's China or Europe, I mean, there's a lot of investment in the U.S., right? Even though they weren't directly tied to it. But anyway, I wasn't setting this up as the topic of conversation, because I was trying to create a platform for the topic at hand, right? Which is your latest book that has been released recently, which is The End of Work. And the reason why I wanted to set up the way that I did is to kind of get an idea of what your perspective on things are in relation to other issues, and really take an issue that is, I think is fascinating, which is just how quickly, our society is evolving. And, the belief, I know a lot of these tech guys have come out and talked about, automation and how robots will, displace, millions and millions of workers. And then their solution to that displacement is, some sort of, universal basic income. But that's not necessarily your take. So I'd love to maybe pivot if that's okay, unless you have a comment.
Absolutely.
But I'd love to pivot to that and kind of what caused the idea behind the book, and what the premise and outcome that you're hoping readers achieve.
Well, it's a great question. What caused it was going to a Fleetwood Mac concert. I'm not a big music guy, but I watched. We were invited to the concert by some friends, and we sat kind of in the back of the arena, and that proved rewarding because we watched the video screen. That was the only way to see the musicians. It was kind of a revelation to me that night. I looked at just the pure joy in their eyes. And so we went to the concert because we thought they're going to retire, so we might as well say that we saw them. And but watching them, I thought they're not going to retire anytime soon. These people are in love with what they're doing. When it comes to instruments and singing, they are geniuses. And so I started thinking about that. If they tried to do what I do, they wouldn't be very smart. If Lindsey Buckingham tried to do what Warren Buffett does, he would be a failure. Now, it's interesting because Warren Buffett put an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago. He said, what if the economy were sports-based? He said, it doesn't matter what kind of instruction or training I would have, I would be a failure in that. And so I thought, and so all this came together for me. I said, wait a second, we're looking at intelligence all wrong. And we're looking at work ethic all wrong. No one lacks intelligence or work ethic. What they've historically lacked are ways to showcase their intelligence and work ethic in the workplace. Think about 150 years ago, to give you an example of this. 150 years ago, when you were born, you pretty much knew what you were going to do for life. There weren't options, really. Once you were able, you were going to work 6 days a week on a farm.
Yep.
It didn't matter if you loved it or hated it, that's what you were going to do. And then these robots came along, labor-saving devices, things like fertilizer, more important, the tractor. Biggest job destroyers in the history of mankind, simply because a world in which work was defined by creating food, suddenly people didn't need to do that. You could produce a lot more food with less people. Did this put people in bread lines? No, it freed them up to focus their genius on things that they were actually good at. And so we cured diseases, we created cars, airplanes, computers, the internet. And so all I'm saying is, what has people fearful is what should have them thrilled. Automation is going to destroy all sorts of work that's unnecessary and allow people to focus their unique intelligence on actual work that reinforces their skills. And so that's what the book is about.
Is there an economic term for that?
I don't know. I'll tell you this, in the book, my economic term for it is Tamny's Law. I am making the argument, and I slightly paraphrase, that as the economy evolves, more and more people escape laziness simply because they are able to do work that elevates their unique skills.
Mm-hmm. So
this runs counter to the popular view that prosperity makes us lazy. No. Prosperity is what enables the creation of all sorts of work that we never imagined. People should be thrilled simply because the destruction of old forms of work are going to allow them to specialize.
So is that all right? So robots, is it the creative destruction kind of Schumpeter principle?
Yes, certainly. Schumpeter's principle is that in an economy there's constant replacement of old ways. To some degree, that's true, but it's kind of like this. You and I working alone on a desert island would probably starve pretty quickly. But you and I working together could specialize, couldn't we? I could say, you do what you do best, I do what I do best, and we maybe survive. All robots they're not putting us out of work. They're just allowing us to specialize more, much in the way that when we divide up work with humans, they allow us to specialize. They take off of our plate the work that's least elevating or amplifying of our skills and allow us to focus on what we do best. I mean, imagine how poor we would be without the tractor. If it were about jobs, it'd be simple. We just abolish the tractor, the car, and the ATM machine and the computer. Everyone in the U.S. would be working. And we'd be incredibly poor, but we'd all be working. All automation says is that we're never going to run out of things to do. Automation will just take off of our hands the things that we'd rather not do.
So what's the argument? What's the argument for universal basic income? What's the premise behind why smart intelligent individuals have come out and said, it's going to go so quick that the displacement is going to be painful, and we need to create a floor for people. Like where is that argument flawed?
Let me say two things about that. For one, I don't think the proponents of it believe it. What I do think is that they realize that as technology continues to advance, they are going to get incredibly rich. And so they're looking to preempt poor government treatment of them by the government by saying, oh, no, we're sympathetic, we're kind people, we want to have a universal basic income. I think the universal basic income is a terrible idea. Imagine giving politicians the right to basically compete with one another to see who can give someone a bigger check with the money of others. I also think it's going to be totally unnecessary. All this automation isn't going to put us out of work. It's going to make it so that more and more people are experts at work. And so there's not going to be a need for it. And my honest belief is that even if you instituted it, the future is going to be so grand that people wouldn't want it in the first place, simply because there are going to be such better ways to make money, and there are going to be, these ways will be elevating their unique skills.
And that's where, and I would say that there are, the future can be defined based on what, exists right now. But at the same time, you always have that, for lack of a better term, that X factor, which is, once there is displacement, human beings just don't sit idle. I mean, they're going to go figure out what to do. And I think in that environment, it may be painful, but I think that pain is good because it really gets people to elevate their game and to innovate and to, improve their lifestyle.
Well, I think you're so right. I want to discuss that. I think you're so right that people won't just sit around, but I think also what you have to remember is the displacement isn't nearly as painful as you think. Where it's painful is in the places that are not embracing this kind of change in advance. Let's be clear. A city or country never dies, or state never dies because a factory closes or a business departs. That's the norm. Look at New York City. Look at Los Angeles in the 1920s. That New York was 1 and LA was 4 in terms of most advanced in terms of a manufacturing economy. Neither is today. They're not dead cities as a result. What kills a city is the departure of talent. And this is important because if we try to prop up the status quo or the past, that's what kills a city. It's the lack of displacement that kills a city, simply because the most talented people who attract all the investment, who create all the companies and exciting jobs, do not want to do factory work. They don't want to work in steel mills. And so if you prop up the past, you drive away the very people who create all the exciting opportunity. And then I would add, look at Silicon Valley. It employs everyone. It's not, I'm horrible technologically, but the beauty of Silicon Valley, the place where jobs are destroyed the quickest, is it doesn't matter your skill. There's an opportunity for you. Silicon Valley employs yoga instructors, personal trainers, baristas, lawyers, doctors, sommeliers, chefs. Silicon Valley is where all the jobs are being destroyed so rapidly, yet everyone is employed at exciting work. Contrast that with Aliquippa, PA, or Flint, Michigan. Yeah, they're stuck in the past and they're employing no one.
That's a great point. Yeah, there's always going to be, you have the primary market, then secondary and tertiary markets as well that serve the primary market. And there's always opportunities, especially with innovation. So one of the, I interviewed, I think he's a presidential candidate. He's running for president. His name Andrew Yang, and he wrote a book called The War on Normal People. And it's basically the opposite of your book. And it was a great discussion. Obviously we disagreed on many points. But in the end, his thing was, it's going to go so fast, okay, that it's almost going to be, even if it's temporary, he was arguing that it's going to be a necessity unless you're going to have social unrest. So maybe if you want to answer that and follow up with the answering the question, how can individuals navigate themselves through a rapidly evolving environment that they may find themselves in?
Well, yeah, the first thing I would say is that Yang gets it exactly backwards. And it staggers me that he could get it so backwards given the truth about history. What we've seen throughout history is that technology, by its very name, destroys jobs. Again, the tractor and fertilizer were the biggest job destroyers in history. The car destroyed countless jobs. The computer. Do you want to discuss how many jobs the computer and the internet destroyed? But they never put people out of work. Implicit in Yang's argument, which is just stunning that someone could make an argument so obtuse based on history, is that we're going to run out of things to cure and fix. Oh, really? But see, people are dying all the time of cancer. We haven't scratched the surface. in terms of our potential. And that's the beauty of technology and economic growth, is that it frees up talented minds from doing what they used to have to do and allows them to focus on better and better and better. This notion that it's going to put people out of work defies common sense. It's just going to allow them to do better work that's going to constantly improve the human condition. Implicit in Yang's argument is that the creation of the tractor just caused everyone to starve. No. It just enabled fewer people to make the food that we needed so that we could focus on better, more important things.
Cool. All right.
The
Thanks,
robots
Steve.
that terrify him are what are going to lead to cancer cures, such that it's no longer a disease, are going to lead to a life where people don't have to worry about heart disease. They're going to wipe out poverty, not put people in poverty. Show me one country in the history of mankind's existence that was impoverished by technology. Yet technology is the biggest job destroyer by definition. It's where jobs are destroyed most rapidly that opportunity is greatest.
So in the, I'm assuming you address this in the book, but how can an individual, whether it's listening to this or reading your book, like what are some of the steps they can take to, navigate themselves? I think having a philosophical foundation where, disruption sometimes is good, robots and evolution and displacement of jobs is good. Once you have that, what are some of the next steps to, pay attention and navigate through these waters?
Well, one way to a degree, you don't have to worry about it. My point is that if you're existing, if you can live and breathe, the opportunities are going to come to you in this evolving world. There will be endless opportunities, ones that kind of elevate your unique skills in a world that's destroying the low value work of the past. And so still, my argument in the book, what I say to people, what I say is that happiness is hard. And by that, I mean that I don't think you can be happy unless you're working. And I don't think you can be happy unless you work really hard. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to consistently do that if you're doing something you hate. Yeah. And that's why the future is so bright. Simply because all this automation is going to free us from a lot of the jobs that we despised in the past, in much the same way that fertilizer and the tractor freed so many people from the daily 6 day a week misery of working on a farm. And so it's not something that people need to be afraid of. But, in my case, look, I wanted to be a writer in the worst way. I wanted to write about economics. I had a belief that I had something to offer. But it's not as though one day I became a writer and I could pay my bills. In my case, and I describe this in the book, I tell my story. I worked a job as a fundraiser for a nonprofit to pay the bills so that I could read and write at night and on weekends. And then gradually over time, I was able to transition into what I wanted to do. Now, other people will have an easier path. Some will have a harder path. I had to be demoted a few times. I had to fail to get to this point. Mm-hmm. But the broad thing is, unlike at any time in history, more and more people, as I show in the book, will, if they have a passion or something that they really love doing, they'll be able to turn it into a career. And that's amazing. And that's a result of all this technological advance that has led to amazing wealth creation.
Well, also, I don't have any examples that are coming to mind, but I would say, the concert that you went to, the Fleetwood Mac concert, or any band or any artist, there's a pivotal moment, and typically it was caused by fear, pain, or some pivotal moment that caused them to think a little bit differently. And I think those are healthy moments, especially for our growth, where it allows you to, solve the issue at hand. And I think the gravitation is always towards something that you like to do, or you feel, you have a talent or a natural ability to do. But oftentimes the painful moment isn't there. And if it's not there, it may not allow you to, transition into a meaningful career or meaningful job. And so I look at the disruption, and I love disruption. I think disruption, is always followed by innovation. It's kind of the I call it the Mowgli principle. I don't know if you have kids, but in the Jungle Book, Mowgli, what separates him from, the bear or the lion or whatever, right, is his ability to think through problems and solve them, right? And I think human beings, you have to have that environment in order to exercise, what our mind can really do. And if you don't have that environment, sometimes you won't have the opportunity.
I would just say again, the disruption really only occurs in the places where there's no disruption. I mean, again, if you go to Seattle right now, where technology reigns supreme, and so old forms of work are being destroyed all the time, jobs are endless for people of all sorts of skills. If you go to places stuck in the past, if you go to Aliquippa, PA, try to find an interesting job. And you're not. And so I think it's important to stress that this disruption that people talk about, this rapid change that supposedly causes pain. No, that's backwards. It's where there isn't rapid change that pain is greatest. And the reason for that is obvious. Again, talented people don't want to be where in parts of the country or world that are stuck in the past, because there's very little opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that was the wrong way of explaining it, because what I intended to say was, if a person is laid off, let's a truck driver, because technology now has trucks being driven by robots and technology, that they're in that position now to make a decision that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to make had they continued to drive the truck. So that's more the point.
Yeah. And it's a good point. And I would just say to that, though, that in most instances, if you look throughout history, in most instances, long before they're laid off, thanks to technologies with truck drivers, as in suddenly self-driving technology renders them no longer economically viable. It's usually the case long before that happens that market signals say, oh yeah, trucking doesn't pay as well as this, and this. Mm-hmm. Technology by definition destroys work, but in the process it's creating all sorts of new work for all sorts of skill sets. And so I think what you're going to, if we get to the point, and I think we will, where trucks are operated by robots, you'll see most truckers depart that industry long before being laid off.
And who knows what the future is going to hold, but I would assume that if it's going to go quickly, maybe there isn't enough runway for them to make that decision. And typically people won't make a decision, to change careers or to change jobs unless the pain is, the pain of changing, right, is less than, greater than the pain of staying the same. So,
well, have you ever left a job for a higher paying job? Have you ever quit a job because something better came along?
Yeah. I've been self-employed forever.
Of course you have.
Yeah,
of course you have. Well, you're just a normal human being. Let's go back to late 1840s, 300,000 people from around the world found their way to the Bay Area, trying to mine gold. Yeah. People run to opportunity all the time. And so this idea that, suddenly I was hit by a freight train. Now, where that more often happens is that a company gets into trouble, and of course, suddenly there's layoffs and recessions occur. Understood. But economic change, what you have to realize, and this is in the U.S., the economic change happens all the time, and so people hear about opportunity. Oh, we hear there's opportunity in Seattle, and so they move. And so what you have to remember is it's easy nowadays. 150 years ago, if you heard about an opportunity in Southern California, you had to risk your life crossing the country on roads that weren't paved. Nowadays, even if you're desperately poor, you get on an air-conditioned bus and get there. And so let's not pretend like it's not nearly as disruptive as we think, or as painful as you think. People quit and get better opportunities all the time. That's what we are. And let's be clear. That is an effect of the fact that the nature of work is constantly changing in the United States. A classic example is the internet. When I got out of college, the Netscape hadn't even gone public yet. The internet realistically didn't even exist. I knew nothing about computers, but everything I do today is related to computers. I had no training in it. Everything I do is internet related. Well, I got into that because that's where the opportunity was. And so it's not like I'm abnormal. I didn't have any skills in that area, but you just learn, you adapt. And it's in the parts of the world where there isn't this constant change, where people are most in pain. Where jobs are being destroyed the quickest is where the opportunity is greatest. The pain is where the change is not occurring. I can't stress that enough, that what you're describing is in fact what would happen in a place like Aliquippa or Flint, Michigan, not in a place where jobs are actually rapidly being destroyed.
Yep. No, those are great points. I've actually not thought about it from that angle. And the observation I've had, and I don't know if there's any empirical data behind this, but the observation of our society being a lot more mobile, right? Traveling a lot more. The convenience of traveling is becoming easier and easier. Whereas like growing up, I never went anywhere, right? Wherever we went by car. Right now, I think it's more feasible for people to relocate. And I think, maybe one of the impediments to relocating in the past is just, the fear of leaving loved ones. But because of Facebook, because of, video technology, people are more willing to do that these days. I wonder if that adds to the dynamic of, this being an exciting opportunity for everyone.
Oh, it's such an important thing. I think we often hear about forgotten parts of the United States. And my response is, wait a second. We descend from people who literally risked their lives crossing oceans and borders in order to get here. And they got here to a place where they arguably didn't know the language, and their ability to be mobile was incredibly limited.
Yeah.
There weren't paved roads or anything. And so you think about what they did, and even then, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he traveled the U.S. in the 19th century, said Americans are restless amid abundance. You realize what a big statement that was, because in Europe, people stayed in the same place for generations, yet Americans are running around looking for opportunity.
Yeah.
And so I hear about forgotten Americans today, when wherever they are, prosperity is not far away, and by extension, opportunity. I say, you've got to be kidding me. All this change that we're fearful of, that's where the opportunity is. That's where the prosperity is. And you're a bus ride away in the worst case scenario.
No, this is a fascinating discussion. They're such great points. And maybe as we kind of conclude our interview, what would you say is the obstacles that confront this theory in relation to how to handle the technological change that's at this point inevitable?
I would say this is where I get a little bit policy oriented. Let me be clear. The book is all about how, unlike at any time in history, if you love football, you can make a life and remunerative career out of it. If you love shopping, you increasingly can. If your passion is wine or food, in the 1970s, if you were a cook, people looked down on you. It wasn't even a professional classification in the 70s. Chef was not a profession, whereas nowadays it's something that we do as an alternative to being a lawyer, doctor, banker, you name it. Okay. And so I'm describing all these forms that, nowadays there aren't just video game players who are professionals, but there are video game coaches. So lucrative as that becomes.
Industry behind, you have multiple industries that support.
All these jobs that we could never have imagined when you and I were kids, that if we had told people we were going to do, they would have really literally wanted us to be committed. And so now they're happening. And so I'm making the point that look at how the world's changed. If you have a passion and you discover it, guaranteed you can find work that's related to this passion. And what a beautiful story about where we are. Okay, so that's what the book is about. But there is policy at the end. Look, there are no companies and no jobs without investment first. Sorry, we can't get no economic school, no ideology, no political theorist can get around that truth. And so I make the basic point. I can't stand Republicans or Democrats. I make the basic point that if you have smaller government, and less taxes, there's going to be more investment in experiments that lead to technological advances that lead to all sorts of work that we never imagined. I also say that the rich are crucial to economic progress for the money they invest, but also for the money they spend. Let's not forget that the first computer cost over $1 million. The first laser printer cost $17,000. The first mobile phone that was brick size and had a half-hour battery life cost $4,000. The rich are venture buyers. They buy things, and if they prove useful, that's a signal to entrepreneurs for what they should mass produce. And I bring all these examples up is think about what a small economy we would be without the computer, without the smartphone, without all of these technological advances the rich enjoyed first. And my point is, if we're a smaller economy, your ability to do work that reflects your passions is greatly reduced. We know this because if you talk to your parents or you talk to them about what their options for their parents, they were much, much less when our economy was smaller. Whereas nowadays, the kids growing up, their opportunities are endless. And so you want economic growth. That's what enables work that doesn't feel like work.
You made an interesting point that in that statement, which I haven't thought of before, but you made the point that the rich, if there's more money, smaller government means obviously less taxes, more money in the hands of those that are creating good amounts of income. But when they make investment, I think that the nature of that investment is different than if it was a government backing a solar company or backing a car company or backing whatever, right? Where you have these individuals who have proven themselves by the remuneration of money that they have, that they know how to analyze a financial statement. They know how to, determine a good leadership team for this company or that company or this idea or that idea. And I never thought of that before. Is that what you meant by that?
Oh, yeah, I meant by that, but I want to stress something bigger than that. Do you know the actor is Ashton Kutcher?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so he's very rich, and he's a big venture capital investor, and he was interviewed recently on a podcast, and he said, you have to understand, to do what I do, to invest as I do, you have to be willing to lose money on just about every single one of your investments in the hope that one or two cover all your losses. Mm-hmm. As in, you've got to be willing to lose a lot of money. That's what's so crucial about the rich. They uniquely can invest in companies, and they have money to lose that the average person does not. And as a result, we get progress. Silicon Valley is built on endless failure. 90% of the companies funded out there die. And so if you go throughout history, who was it that funded Thomas Edison? It was J.P. Morgan. Mm-hmm. His father thought he was nuts. The light bulb, he had money to lose. Howard Hughes inherited Hughes Tool and Die, and he takes that money out to Los Angeles and funds the creation of the evolution of aviation. Who do you think funded Silicon Valley, without which would be an incredibly small economy? It was the heirs to Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Phipps, families so rich that they had money to lose. And so the rich, without them, there is no economic progress because they have the means to take risks on companies that will fail the majority of the time. You add to that also that the rich are the venture buyers. They can buy things that are wildly expensive that anyone else couldn't afford, but in doing so, they signal to entrepreneurs what would be popular in the future if they mass produce it. And so the rich had the means to buy computers that cost over $1 million, laser printers that cost $17,000. Imagine where we'd be without them. We would be much poorer. And as a result, the ability for the average person to pursue a passion on the way to a career would be greatly reduced. Again, without the rich, more of us would be farming and doing something that we hate, but that we have to do.
So what would you say are the key differences, maybe set aside the principle of taxation, but what are the maybe key principles between the rich making an investment in, a business or technology, and, a government funding it?
Oh, it's a great question, and I'm so glad you asked. Here's the difference. It's not that governments are bad or that people in government are inherently bad, but here's the crucial difference. And this is why Warren Buffett would be an awful investor if he were Senator Buffett. With government, there are no failures. Your bad ideas will be funded forever simply because you've got an unlimited flow of taxpayer dollars. Contrast that with Silicon Valley. Bad ideas die, and they die very quickly. And they die at a rate of 90% plus. And so because of that, bad ideas aren't funded forever, such that people and human capital and financial capital and equipment aren't misused forever. The failure happens, and these crucial assets are released to what are perceived to be better opportunities. Failures happen quickly. Failure is how you progress. But with government, there are no failures. Bad ideas are funded forever. And so that's the difference. And you could, of course, argue that if you're talented, you'd never work as an investor for the government because there's too much money in the private sector. But the main thing is, it doesn't matter who's doing it. If your bad ideas never die, you can't progress. Well, Silicon Valley is not rich because all of its businesses succeed. It's rich precisely because just about every business funded out there fails. And with that, you get progress.
No, it's a fascinating idea. I'm excited to read your book. I mean, we're going to post links of how you can purchase it. Do you have an audiobook as well?
Yes, you can buy it on Kindle and all sorts of different ways. But you can buy it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, you name it. The End of Work. It's a very optimistic book for parents and kids. For parents who are worried about their kids, what I show is that if you can find a passion, doesn't matter what your education is, doesn't matter if you go to college at all, you will have a chance to succeed simply because hard work combined with passion is what will enable success. And then for kids, it hopefully will cause them to think about work in a different way. Don't look at work in a 20th century mindset that you have to do certain things to succeed. What we're seeing in this modern world is that the path to achievement and the path to unique jobs is endless. And that's what's so exciting about the present and future.
So do you go into, because that's one of my, because I have kids, so they're in school. I mean, do you address, just education in general and how the future will be different than maybe what they're being prepared for right now?
Yes, I do in chapter 3. And I make the argument that education is just not that important.
Awesome.
This notion that school can prepare you for the working world is laughable.
Yeah.
Because implicit there is that professors could see into the future. Well, if you could see into the future what the future of work was going to be, you wouldn't be working as a professor. You'd be making billions in the private sector.
Yeah.
And so by definition, school is teaching you about the past. I'm not saying don't go. People go to school for all sorts of reasons, but don't go on the assumption that it's going to prepare you for the working world, because it is not going to. And so I use music as an example to make that point. But the broader thing is toward the end of the chapter, I showcase China. China is easily one of the least educated societies on earth. Yet it's become very rich, or relatively rich in modern times, not because of education. Its citizenry is broadly uneducated, but because the people were suddenly free. And my point is that freedom is what drives prosperity. Education. The U.S. has all sorts of great schools because it is a rich country. It is not a rich country because of those great schools. Like soon enough, China will have amazing universities too. Rich people love to donate a lot to schools. But it is not going to drive your success. And this is important for kids. You and I would look askance at anyone who would say to someone, well, you can't make it because you're a woman or because you're the wrong color. Yeah. Well, I think we should look every bit as cruelly at someone and meanly at someone who would say, you can't make it because you didn't get a degree. Mm-hmm. Why on earth would you say that? Yeah. It's wrong, and it has nothing to do with reality. What allows success is freedom, education. Oh gosh, that's what rich people do. We're a rich country. Lots of us are educated. So what?
No, my wife gets after me because I always tell my kids, when they get their grades, if they happen to get a poor grade, I'm like, it doesn't matter. What matters is did you try? And if you didn't like it, then your grade doesn't matter. It's more of like, the principle of trying, experimenting, and if it wasn't natural, then. But I would say, there's this this box that the kids are they're conditioned to fit in, And, I would argue that there's so many different aspects of children these days, of their intelligence that's superior than their teachers. But yeah, it's never really enhanced, unfortunately, obviously with some exceptions.
Yeah, no, we're lucky enough to live at a time where we don't have to worry about that. Education was always overrated. Look, I'm not against it. I've got a child. I hope she goes to college. It's an amazing experience. But the idea that she needs it to succeed or to learn things that will help her in the working world, oh, please, that's just not serious.
I 100% agree. All right, one more question, then I'll let you go, John. So last question is kind of just out of curiosity, like what's maybe a conversation you've had recently where the person you were having the conversation with, a light bulb went off, right? They had a paradigm shift. They saw the way in which you were thinking and started to agree with you, maybe not having the same opinion at the beginning of the conversation, or it happened to you.
That's a very good question. I'll tell you this, more what it's been is when I tell people what this is about, they say, oh my gosh, you're nuts. And then I start describing it. And then everyone I've described it to has since said, oh yeah, well, you know what? I've got a nephew who's made a career out of rehabilitating old Air Jordan shoes and selling them for $4,000. And then you start getting emails from them. Did you see this? The NBA just staged a draft, but for video game players, it's NBA 2K. And they'll say, and so now from people who thought, oh, what are you talking about? They are now my source of all these interesting jobs that they never knew existed before. Because when you start to look around you, you say, hey, wait a second. Whereas 150 years ago, you kind of had one of two odds of working on the farm for life. Now, look at all the different ways you can earn a living. And so, look, I'm happy to say it's been eye-opening for some. There are people high up in media, I won't name names, who've just dismissed me out of hand, wouldn't even have me on their shows. They say, what you're describing is ridiculous. And so that's been an eye-opener too. But this is a debate I welcome. I think this is what the future is going to look like. I can't tell you what the jobs are going to be. If I could, I'd be a billionaire. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you that I so envy your kids, because the world they are going to rise up into is going to reward their skills in ways that is going to amaze you. And it's probably going to be an adjustment for you. Your kids, one of them might say to you, I'm going to do something that you'll say, wait a second, that's not a job. But they'll prove you wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think it's going to be wonderful for you in that way.
And it'll probably be something that, we have no clue about right now, what it is, what it means, how it's defined, how you monetize it. I mean, there's so much innovation going on right now in the creation of humankind is it's part of our wiring. And I think that the environment that we're in right now it's an exciting time to be alive. There's nothing really to be afraid of. I mean, there are certain things, but it's just part of humanity.
There's that show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? I didn't see the show, but again, another one of the converts told me about it. I'll leave you this. He was watching it, and they had young kids on competing on the show, and so they asked one genius young kid, so what are you going to do when you grow up? And he said, my job hasn't been invented yet. Exactly.
Awesome. That's
so smart, because he nailed it.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, John, it's been fascinating. I wish you the best of luck with your book. I mean, we'll get the word out. We'll make sure that we post all of your social media connections and website, as well as the organizations you're associated with. And good luck. I mean, the mission you're on. It's a task, right? Because I can understand that there are probably some of those that are in the upper echelon that will refute this message to the grave. But I believe that this is the future, and this is the way to approach it. So thank you for writing the book, and thank you for going out there, and, facing some adversity sometimes, getting your message out. Absolutely, it's all worth it. Well, thank you so much for having me on. What a great interview! Congratulations on what you're doing, because you're doing a great job. Well, I appreciate it, John. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for joining us as the Wealth Standard Podcast spends all of 2018 celebrating life, liberty, and property. Be sure to leave us a review on iTunes, and we'll see you on the next one.